My name is Alma Bennett, and the day I buried my husband of 27 years was the day I discovered I had been sharing him with someone else. I thought grief was supposed to be the hardest part of that Tuesday morning in October. I thought watching them lower Marcus into the ground would break me in ways I'd never recover from. But as I stood there in my black dress, clutching a crumpled tissue that had long since stopped being useful, staring at the woman in the front row who had taken my seat, I realized that heartbreak has layers. And sometimes the deepest cut comes not from death, but from the realization that the life you thought you were living was never really yours at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She was beautiful in that effortless way that makes other women feel suddenly aware of every flaw. Auburn hair that caught the morning light, a navy dress that fit like it was tailored specifically for her frame, and tears streaming down her face with the kind of raw, unguarded grief that I recognized, because I had been feeling it myself for the past week. The difference was, she was sitting in the front row where I should have been, where the widow belongs, where 27 years of marriage had earned me the right to sit. And I was standing in the back like a distant relative who had shown up out of obligation. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes and the practiced compassion of someone who guides people through their worst days for a living, had approached me an hour before the service began. "Mrs. Bennett," he said in that careful voice people use when they're about to deliver news they know will hurt, "there seems to be some confusion about the seating arrangements. A young woman arrived early, and she's quite insistent that she belongs in the front row. She says she was very close to your husband. Very close to your husband." Those words echoed in my head as I stared at this stranger who was sobbing over my husband's casket like she had lost the love of her life. And maybe she had. Maybe Marcus had been living two lives, loving two women, promising two futures, and the only reason I was finding out now was because death doesn't allow for the careful choreography that adultery requires. I had met Marcus Bennett when I was 28 and he was 31. I was working as a pediatric nurse at Riverside Children's Hospital, pulling double shifts and surviving on coffee and the occasional stolen moment of quiet in the supply closet. He was a contractor then, building the new wing of the hospital, and every day for 3 months he would stop by the nurse's station, with some excuse about blueprints or scheduling, but really just to see me. He had this way of leaning against the counter, hard hat tucked under his arm, sawdust still clinging to his work boots, and he would ask about my day like the answer actually mattered to him. Our first date was at a diner called Millie's that served breakfast all day and had red vinyl booths that squeaked when you moved. He ordered pancakes at 7 in the evening and defended his choice by saying that breakfast food was superior to dinner food, and anyone who disagreed was missing out on one of life's simple pleasures. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee, and I knew right then that this man with his easy smile and ridiculous opinions about pancakes was going to change everything for me. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at St. Catherine's Church, the same church where we were now saying goodbye to him forever. I wore my grandmother's pearls, and he cried when I walked down the aisle, actually cried, which made me cry, and by the time we reached the altar we were both laughing through our tears like two people who had just discovered something wonderful and couldn't quite believe their luck. For 27 years I thought that luck had held. We bought a house on Maple Street with a wraparound porch and room for the children we planned to have. The children never came, not for lack of trying or wanting, but sometimes life has different plans than the ones you make. We grieved that loss together, held each other through the disappointment, and eventually filled the empty bedrooms with Marcus's home office and my craft room, and a guest room for the nieces and nephews who visited on holidays. Marcus built his own construction company, Bennett & Sons, even though there were no sons to inherit it. It was a joke that stopped being funny after a while, but he kept the name because he said it sounded established, trustworthy. I stayed at the hospital until I was 45, when a back injury from lifting a particularly squirmy 7-year-old forced me into early retirement. Marcus said it was a blessing in disguise, that now I could focus on the things I really loved, like my pottery and my garden and the volunteer work I did at the animal shelter. He was right, mostly. I did love those things. I loved the way clay felt between my fingers, the way I could shape something beautiful out of nothing but earth and water and patience. I loved watching my tomatoes grow from tiny seeds into plants that produced fruit we would eat in salads all summer long. I loved the way the dogs at the shelter would remember me from week to week, tails wagging the moment they saw me coming down the hall with treats and tennis balls and all the affection I had to give. But looking back now, standing in that funeral home staring at the woman who was grieving my husband like she had the right to, I wondered if Marcus had been right for different reasons. Maybe my early retirement wasn't a blessing for me, maybe it was a convenience for him. Maybe it was easier to conduct an affair when your wife was safely occupied with hobbies and volunteer work, when she had her own life and her own schedule and no reason to question where you were every Thursday evening when you said you were meeting with clients. I had trusted him completely. That was my mistake, though I didn't know it was a mistake until I was standing in the back of his funeral watching another woman claim the grief that should have been mine alone. I trusted him when he said he had to work late. I trusted him when he said the phone calls that interrupted our dinners were from suppliers and subcontractors. I trusted him when he started taking more business trips, when he began traveling to job sites that seemed farther and farther from home. Trust, I was learning, is a dangerous thing when it's given to someone who doesn't deserve it. It's like handing someone the keys to your house and never changing the locks, never wondering who else might have copies, never questioning whether the person you gave them to is the same person who's been coming and going as they please. The woman in the front row had stopped crying, but she was still staring at the casket with an intensity that made my chest tight. She looked like she was memorizing something, like she was trying to hold on to a moment she would never get back. I recognized that look because I had been wearing it myself for the past week, ever since the phone call from the hospital telling me that Marcus had collapsed on a job site, that they had tried everything, that I needed to come quickly if I wanted to say goodbye. I hadn't made it in time. By the time I arrived at the emergency room, he was already gone, and the doctor was explaining to me about heart attacks and how sometimes they happen so quickly that there's nothing anyone can do. I stood in that sterile hallway with its fluorescent lights and industrial carpet, listening to words like massive myocardial infarction and sudden cardiac arrest, and all I could think was that we hadn't said goodbye. Our last conversation had been about grocery shopping, about whether we needed milk and if I could pick up his dry cleaning on my way home from the shelter. Milk and dry cleaning. Those were the last words we exchanged, and now he was gone, and I would never get the chance to tell him I loved him one more time, never get the chance to ask him if he was happy, if our quiet life together had been enough for him, if there was anything he wished he had said or done differently. Apparently there was. Apparently there was a whole other life he had been living, a whole other woman he had been loving, a whole other version of himself that I had never met. And she was sitting in my seat at his funeral, crying the tears that should have been mine to cry alone. I wanted to approach her, to demand answers, to ask her who she was, and how long this had been going on, and whether Marcus had ever mentioned me at all. But I couldn't move. I was frozen between rage and disbelief, between the urge to confront her and the fear of what I might learn. Because as much as I wanted to know the truth, I was terrified that the truth would shatter the last 27 years of my life into pieces so small I would never be able to put them back together. The service began without me in the front row. Pastor Williams, who had married us at this same church nearly 3 decades ago, spoke about Marcus in the gentle, generic way that funeral services require. He talked about his work ethic, his dedication to his community, his love for his family. He mentioned me by name, spoke about our long marriage and the life we had built together, and I watched the woman in the front row flinch every time he said the word wife. She knew about me. That much was clear. This wasn't some innocent friendship that had been misconstrued, or some business relationship that had crossed professional lines. She knew Marcus was married, knew I existed, and yet she was here claiming her place in his death the same way she had apparently claimed her place in his life. Marcus's brother Daniel spoke next, sharing stories about their childhood, about the time Marcus had tried to build a treehouse and ended up with a pile of lumber and a broken ankle, about how even as a boy Marcus had been determined to build things, to create something lasting with his hands. I had heard these stories before, had laughed at them over holiday dinners and family gatherings, but hearing them now felt different. They felt like they belonged to someone else, Like the Marcus I had known was just one version of a man who had been many different things to many different people. The woman in the front row laughed at Daniel's stories, actually laughed, and the sound was like a knife between my ribs. She knew these stories too. She had heard them before. Marcus had shared with her the same pieces of himself that I thought were mine alone, had given her access to the same memories and experiences and family anecdotes that I had cherished as intimate gifts between husband and wife. When the service ended and people began to file out of the church, she finally stood up. She was taller than I had expected, probably 5'8" in her heels, and she moved with the kind of confident grace that comes naturally to some women and never comes at all to others. She didn't look around the room, didn't seek out eye contact with anyone, but she walked directly to the casket and placed her hand on the polished wood for a long moment before whispering something I couldn't hear. Then she walked toward the back of the church, toward the exit, toward me. Our eyes met for just a second as she passed, and I saw something in her face that I hadn't expected. Not defiance or guilt or embarrassment, but recognition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She knew who I was, just as I now knew who she was. And in that brief moment of eye contact, we acknowledged each other in the way that women do when they share a secret they never wanted to keep. She was almost to the door when I found my voice. "Excuse me," I called out, and she stopped but didn't turn around. The few remaining people in the church looked up, sensing drama in the way that people always do when they catch the scent of conflict in the air. She turned slowly, and I could see that she was younger than I had thought, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of skin that suggested she had been careful about sunscreen, and the kind of figure that suggested she had been careful about everything else. "I'm Alma Bennett," I said, though I knew she already knew that. "Marcus's wife." She nodded once, a small, sharp movement that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been dismissal. "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was softer than I had expected, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I'm sorry for your loss. Sorry for my loss." As if she hadn't lost anything. As if she hadn't been sitting in the front row of my husband's funeral crying like her heart was breaking. As if she was offering condolences to a stranger, instead of standing face to face with the woman whose life she had been stealing from for who knows how long. I wanted to ask her how long it had been going on. I wanted to ask her if she loved him and if he loved her, and if he had ever talked about leaving me. I wanted to ask her if she was the reason he had started working late and traveling more and seeming distracted during our quiet dinners together. I wanted to ask her if she knew about the pottery classes I took on Tuesday evenings, and the way Marcus always made sure there was fresh coffee waiting for me when I got home. I wanted to ask her if she knew that he hated Brussels sprouts but would eat them anyway when I made them, because he didn't want to hurt my feelings. But instead I just stared at her, this beautiful stranger who had somehow become a part of my life without my knowledge or consent. And I realized that I didn't know how to have this conversation. There's no handbook for confronting your dead husband's mistress at his funeral. There's no etiquette guide for this particular kind of betrayal. She seemed to understand my silence. Or maybe she was just eager to escape a situation that was uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Again, I'm sorry," she said, and then she walked out of the church and out of my life as quickly as she had entered it, leaving me standing alone in the back row with questions I might never get answered, and grief that was now complicated by anger and humiliation and a kind of loneliness I had never experienced before. The burial was smaller, just family and close friends, and she didn't come. I stood at the graveside listening to Pastor Williams say his final words, watching them lower the casket into the ground, and I felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with death, and everything to do with deception. Marcus was gone, but the man I was burying wasn't the man I thought I had married. That man, the one I had loved and trusted and built a life with, had apparently never existed at all. After everyone left and the cemetery workers began filling in the grave, I stayed behind. I had brought a single white rose, something simple and classic that seemed appropriate for a widow's final tribute, but as I held it in my hands I wondered if she had brought flowers too. I wondered if she would come back later, after dark, to leave her own tokens of love and loss at his grave. I wondered if she knew where he was buried, if she had followed the funeral procession from a distance, if she was somewhere nearby right now waiting for me to leave so she could have her own moment of goodbye. The thought made me angry in a way I hadn't been angry in years, maybe ever. Not the quick flash of irritation that comes from traffic jams or rude salespeople, but a deep, burning fury that started in my stomach and spread through my chest like acid. How dare she? How dare they both? How dare Marcus live a double life for however long this had been going on? And how dare she participate in it? And how dare she show up at his funeral like she had every right to be there? I dropped the rose on his grave and walked back to my car, my heels sinking slightly into the soft ground with each step. I drove home to our house on Maple Street, the house we had bought together and filled with shared memories and future plans that would never come to fruition. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a long time, staring at the front porch where we used to sit on summer evenings, at the windows where I had hung curtains we had picked out together, at the door we had walked through as newlyweds 27 years ago. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that Marcus had been keeping secrets, that he had been living parts of his life somewhere else with someone else. I wondered if he had brought her to this house. If she had been in our bedroom, in our kitchen, sitting at our dining room table eating off plates we had received as wedding gifts. I wondered if she knew about the loose board on the front step that Marcus kept meaning to fix, or the way the bathroom door stuck if you didn't push it just right, or the hiding place behind the bookshelf where we kept our emergency cash. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway, and for the first time in 27 years, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a museum of a life that had never been as real as I thought it was, full of artifacts from a marriage that had apparently been built on lies. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing everything with new eyes, wondering what else I didn't know, what other secrets Marcus had been keeping, what other ways my life had been a fiction. His office was exactly as he had left it, papers scattered across the desk, reading glasses folded next to his computer, coffee mug with a ring stain on the bottom sitting next to a stack of invoices. I had always respected his workspace, had never gone through his files or his computer or his phone, because I trusted him, and because he had asked me to give him privacy for his business dealings. But trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. I sat down in his chair and opened the top drawer of his desk. It was full of the usual office supplies, pens and paper clips and sticky notes, nothing unusual or suspicious. The second drawer contained files related to his business, contracts and estimates and receipts, all organized in his neat handwriting with dates and client names. I recognized most of the names, local businesses and homeowners who had hired Bennett & Sons over the years. But in the back of the file drawer, behind a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019, I found something that made my hands shake. A manila envelope with no label, sealed but not taped, like it had been opened and closed many times. Inside were photographs, not professional ones, but the kind you print at home on regular paper. Photos of Marcus with her, the woman from the funeral, spanning what looked like several years based on the changing seasons in the backgrounds and the slight differences in their appearances. They were happy in these photos, genuinely happy in the way that people are when they think no one is watching. Marcus's arm around her shoulders at what looked like a street festival, both of them laughing at something off camera. The two of them sitting at a restaurant table, hands intertwined, looking at each other with the kind of intense focus that comes in the early stages of love. A photo of them hiking, sweaty and tired but grinning. Her wearing one of his baseball caps that I recognized from our own closet. There were dozens of them, a complete record of a relationship I had known nothing about. A visual timeline of my husband falling in love with another woman while I was at home making dinner and tending my garden and believing that we were happy together. The most recent photo looked like it had been taken just weeks ago, the two of them at what appeared to be a beach somewhere, her head on his shoulder, both of them looking relaxed and content and completely unaware that their secret was being documented. At the bottom of the envelope was a folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, I found an address written in Marcus's handwriting. 847 Cedarwood Drive, apartment 2B. Below the address was a phone number and a name, Rebecca Walsh. Rebecca Walsh. The woman from the funeral finally had a name, and apparently she had an address too, one that Marcus had written down and kept in a hidden envelope with their photos like some kind of treasure. I stared at the paper for a long time, memorizing the address, imagining the apartment where they had been meeting, where Marcus had been living a part of his life that had nothing to do with me. I wanted to drive there immediately, to confront her, to demand explanations and apologies, and answers to all the questions that were multiplying in my head like cancer cells. But it was getting late, and I was exhausted from the funeral, and the discovery, and the emotional whiplash of losing my husband and learning he had been betraying me simultaneously. So I folded the paper and put it in my purse, and I decided that Rebecca Walsh and her apartment on Cedarwood Drive could wait until tomorrow. That night I lay in the bed I had shared with Marcus for 27 years, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how I had gotten here. How had I been so blind, so trusting, so naive? How had I lived with someone for nearly 3 decades and never noticed that he was living a double life? How had I missed the signs that must have been there, the clues that any other woman would have picked up on? But even as I asked myself these questions, I knew the answers weren't simple. Marriage, especially a long marriage, becomes a kind of routine, a series of habits and assumptions and unspoken agreements about how life will work. You stop questioning things because questioning takes energy, and after a while you'd rather save that energy for other things. You trust because the alternative is constant suspicion, and constant suspicion is no way to live. Marcus had been good at compartmentalizing, good at keeping his two worlds separate, good at making me feel loved and secure even while he was betraying me. He still brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. He still kissed me goodbye when he left for work and hello when he came home. He still remembered our anniversary, and my birthday, and the day we adopted our cat Smokey from the animal shelter. He was still tender and attentive and present in all the ways that mattered for daily life. But apparently he was also tender and attentive and present with Rebecca Walsh, giving her pieces of himself that I had thought belonged only to me. And that was the part that hurt the most. Not just that he had been unfaithful, but that he had been loving. This wasn't some meaningless affair or one-night stand or moment of weakness. This was a relationship, complete with photos and shared experiences, and what looked like genuine happiness. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the bedroom curtains, and the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was my sister Caroline, calling from Phoenix, where she lived with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. "Alma, honey, I'm so sorry I couldn't make it to the funeral yesterday," she said, and I could hear genuine regret in her voice. "David's surgery got moved up, and I couldn't leave him, but I've been thinking about you constantly. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I lied, because I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't grieving just the loss of my husband, but the discovery that my entire marriage had been a lie. Caroline had met Marcus a few times over the years, when she visited or when we traveled to Phoenix for holidays, and she had always liked him, always said how lucky I was to have found such a good man. The idea of telling her that the good man had been living a secret life with another woman felt like admitting that I had been living a delusion for 27 years. "Are you eating?" she asked, in the way that sisters do when they're worried about you but too far away to check for themselves. "Are you sleeping? Do you need me to come stay with you for a while?" "I'm managing," I said, which was technically true even if managing meant discovering evidence of adultery in my dead husband's desk drawer. "I have some things to take care of this week. Some loose ends to tie up." After I hung up with Caroline, I made myself breakfast even though I wasn't hungry, because eating breakfast was something normal people did and I was trying very hard to feel normal even though nothing about my life felt normal anymore. I sat at the kitchen table where Marcus and I had shared thousands of meals together, and I stared at the piece of paper with Rebecca Walsh's address on it. 847 Cedarwood Drive was about 20 minutes from our house, in a newer development that had gone up in the last 10 years. I had probably driven past it dozens of times without giving it a second thought, never knowing that my husband's secret life was unfolding behind one of those anonymous apartment windows. The thought made me feel nauseous, not just because of the betrayal but because of the proximity. She had been so close all this time, close enough that Marcus could probably visit her on his lunch breaks, close enough that they could see each other regularly without raising suspicion about long absences or overnight trips. I finished my coffee and got dressed, choosing my clothes carefully like I was preparing for battle, which in a way I suppose I was. I drove slowly through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the houses where we knew all the neighbors, past the park where we used to walk in the evenings, past the elementary school, where I had volunteered to read to kindergartners, until my back injury made it too difficult to sit in those tiny chairs. Everything looked the same as it always had, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes, like I was a stranger visiting someone else's life. The woman who had lived here for 27 years, who had been content with her quiet marriage and her pottery classes and her volunteer work, that woman was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize yet, someone angry and suspicious and capable of things I had never imagined myself doing. Like driving to my dead husband's mistress's apartment building and sitting in the parking lot trying to decide what I was going to say to her. The parking lot at Cedarwood Drive was half empty on a Thursday morning, with most residents presumably at work or going about their normal lives, while I sat in my Honda Accord, trying to summon the courage to walk up to apartment 2B and knock on Rebecca Walsh's door. I had been sitting there for almost an hour, watching people come and go, imagining what I would say when I finally faced the woman who had been sharing my husband for God knows how long. A young mother emerged from the building carrying a toddler and a diaper bag, struggling with the heavy glass door while balancing everything in her arms. An elderly man walked his small white dog around the perimeter of the parking lot, stopping every few feet to let the animal sniff at bushes and fire hydrants. A delivery truck pulled up and the driver consulted his clipboard before heading toward the entrance with a package. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that I was sitting in my car having an emotional breakdown over my dead husband's secret affair. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and was startled by what I saw. My eyes were red-rimmed and slightly wild, my hair was escaping from the careful bun I had pinned it into that morning, and there was a coffee stain on my blouse that I hadn't noticed until now. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman whose life had been turned upside down and who was operating on anger and caffeine and very little sleep. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me functioning through 27 years of marriage and 43 years of nursing and all the small crises and disappointments that make up a normal life, was telling me to go home. What was I going to accomplish by confronting Rebecca Walsh? Marcus was dead. The affair was over by virtue of his death, if not by choice. Nothing I could say or do would bring him back or erase the betrayal, or give me the answers I was desperate to have. But the irrational part of my brain, the part that was fueled by rage and humiliation and a desperate need to understand how my life had become a lie, refused to listen to reason. I needed to see where Marcus had been going when he told me he was working late. I needed to understand what Rebecca Walsh had given him that I apparently couldn't. I needed to look this woman in the eye and ask her if she had any idea what it felt like to discover that your entire marriage had been a performance. I got out of the car before I could change my mind, locked the doors with hands that were trembling slightly, and walked toward the apartment building with the kind of determined stride that comes from knowing you're about to do something stupid but being unable to stop yourself. The building was newer than I had expected, with clean brick walls and landscaping that suggested the management company actually cared about curb appeal. There was a security system at the front entrance, a panel with buttons for each apartment, and a small speaker for visitors to announce themselves. I stood in front of the panel for a long moment, staring at the button labeled 2B Walsh, and realized I had no idea what I was going to say. "Hello, I'm Alma Bennett. You may remember me from my husband's funeral where you sat in my seat. Hi. I found photos of you and my dead husband in his desk drawer, and I was wondering if you could explain what the hell was going on. Excuse me, but were you sleeping with Marcus for our entire marriage or just the last few years?" None of these options seemed adequate, but before I could lose my nerve entirely, I pressed the button and waited. The speaker crackled to life after a few seconds, and I heard her voice, the same soft voice that had offered me condolences at the funeral. "Hello." My throat felt dry and tight, but I managed to speak. "Rebecca, this is Alma Bennett, Marcus's wife. I think we need to talk." There was a long pause, long enough that I wondered if she was going to pretend she wasn't home or claim she didn't know who I was. But then the door buzzed open and her voice came through the speaker again, resigned and tired. "Second floor, apartment 2B. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs feeling heavier with each step, and by the time I reached the second floor landing, I was out of breath in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the fact that I was about to come face to face with the woman who had been stealing my life without my knowledge. Apartment 2B was at the end of the hall, and the door was already open when I reached it, Rebecca Walsh standing in the doorway wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked different than she had at the funeral, younger and more vulnerable without the navy dress and careful makeup. But she was still beautiful, Still the kind of woman who made other women wonder what secrets she knew about skincare and exercise, and the kind of effortless grace that some people are born with, and others spend their whole lives trying to cultivate. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me enter her apartment, and I walked past her into a space that was everything my house wasn't. Modern and minimalist, where mine was traditional and cluttered, filled with clean lines and neutral colors, where mine was full of family photos and pottery I had made over the years, and the accumulated debris of a long marriage. But it was clearly a space where Marcus had spent time. His reading glasses were on the coffee table next to a book I recognized, a thriller he had been talking about wanting to read. There was a men's jacket hanging over the back of one of the dining room chairs, a jacket I was pretty sure I had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. The kitchen counter held a bottle of the expensive scotch he liked to drink on special occasions, the same brand he kept in our liquor cabinet at home. I stood in the middle of her living room, surrounded by evidence of my husband's double life, and felt something inside me crack open like an egg dropped on concrete. This wasn't just some casual affair or brief fling. This was a life, complete and established and comfortable, and Marcus had been living it while I was at home, believing we were happy together. "Would you like some coffee?" Rebecca asked, and her politeness in the face of this impossible situation made me want to scream. She was offering me refreshments in the apartment where she had been carrying on an affair with my husband, as if this was some kind of normal social visit instead of the confrontation it actually was. "No," I said, my voice sharper than I had intended. "I don't want coffee. I want answers." She nodded and gestured toward the couch, but I remained standing. I wasn't here to get comfortable. I was here to understand how my life had been systematically dismantled without my knowledge, and comfort was the last thing I was interested in. "How long?" I asked, cutting straight to the heart of what I needed to know. "How long were you sleeping with my husband?" Rebecca looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap in a way that suggested she had been expecting this question but dreading having to answer it. 4 years, she said quietly. "It started 4 years ago. 4 years. 4 years of lies and deception, and secret phone calls, and mysterious late nights, and business trips that probably had nothing to do with business. 4 years of Marcus coming home to me after spending time with her, kissing me hello and asking about my day, and sitting across from me at the dinner table while I talked about my pottery classes and my volunteer work and the book I was reading, never knowing that half his mind was somewhere else with someone else. 4 years of my life that had been built on a foundation of betrayal, and I had been completely oblivious to all of it. How did it start? I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know. The details of how affairs begin are usually mundane and disappointing, full of coincidences and opportunities, and small betrayals that grow into larger ones. "I hired him to renovate my kitchen," she said, still not looking at me. "I had just moved here from Portland, and the apartment needed work. Marcus came recommended by my landlord. It was supposed to take 2 weeks, but there were complications with the plumbing, and it ended up taking over a month. Of course it did." I remembered that job now, vaguely, one of dozens that Marcus had worked on over the years. He had mentioned it at the time, complained about the unexpected problems and the delays, but I had been dealing with my own issues at work and hadn't paid much attention. The hospital was going through layoffs and restructuring, and I was focused on trying to keep my job and help my patients and manage the stress of an uncertain future. While I was worried about losing my job, Marcus was falling in love with another woman over kitchen renovations and plumbing problems. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Rebecca continued, and now she did look up at me, her eyes bright with tears that I had no sympathy for whatsoever. "He told me he was married from the beginning. I told him I wasn't looking for anything serious. We were both adults, we both knew it was complicated. But it happened anyway," I said, my voice flat and cold. She nodded. He was easy to talk to. He listened when I told him about my divorce, about why I had moved here, about starting over. And he was lonely. Lonely. The word hit me like a physical blow, because if Marcus had been lonely, that was something I should have known. That was something I should have been able to fix. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, shared meals and conversations, and the daily intimacy of a long marriage. How could he have been lonely when I was right there? But even as I asked myself the question, I knew the answer. Loneliness in a marriage isn't about proximity. It's about connection. And somewhere along the way, without either of us realizing it, Marcus and I had stopped connecting. We had fallen into the comfortable routine that long marriages often become, where you love each other out of habit rather than passion, where you coexist peacefully but separately, like roommates who happen to share a bed. I thought about our dinners together over the past 4 years, how we had sat across from each other night after night, talking about safe topics like the weather and the neighbors, and what needed to be done around the house. I thought about how we had stopped really looking at each other, how conversations had become functional rather than intimate, how we had both retreated into our own separate interests and hobbies and routines. When was the last time I had asked Marcus about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for the future? When was the last time he had asked me? When was the last time we had talked about anything deeper than grocery lists and household maintenance and the mundane logistics of daily life? I couldn't remember, and that realization was almost as painful as discovering the affair itself. He said you were growing apart, Rebecca said softly, and I could tell she was trying to be gentle, trying to explain without completely destroying me. He said you were both content, but not really happy, that you were living parallel lives instead of a shared one. The accuracy of that assessment was like a knife between my ribs. Marcus had seen what I had been too comfortable or too complacent to acknowledge, that our marriage had become a pleasant arrangement rather than a passionate partnership. But instead of talking to me about it, instead of suggesting counseling or a trip together, or even just a difficult conversation about how we could reconnect, he had found what he was missing with someone else. Did he love you? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands again. Yes, she said finally. And I loved him too. The simple honesty of her response was somehow worse than if she had been defensive or apologetic or tried to minimize what they had meant to each other. She loved him and he loved her, and they had built something real and meaningful together while I was at home believing I was the only woman in his life. Were you going to leave me? I asked. Were you planning a future together? She shook her head. He said he could never do that to you. He said you didn't deserve to be hurt, that you were a good person who had never done anything wrong. He said he loved you too, in a different way, and that he owed you more than abandonment after 27 years. So I was the obligation. I was the wife he stayed with out of duty and guilt and some misguided sense of loyalty, while she was the woman he chose to be with out of love and desire and genuine happiness. I was the burden he carried, and she was the joy he sought. The apartment was silent except for the sound of traffic from the street below and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I looked around again at the space where Marcus had been happy, where he had found what was missing from his life with me, and I tried to imagine him here. I tried to picture him sitting on this couch, cooking in this kitchen, waking up in this bed on the mornings when he had told me he was traveling for work. How often? I asked. How often was he here? 2 or 3 times a week, she said. Sometimes more. He had a key. Of course he did. Of course Marcus had a key to Rebecca Walsh's apartment while I was at home. Assuming he was working late, or meeting with clients, or dealing with the 1,000 small crises that construction projects always seem to generate. Of course he had been coming here for dinner and conversation, and the kind of intimacy that had slowly drained out of our marriage without either of us acknowledging it. I thought about all the evenings I had spent alone, reading or working on pottery or watching television, assuming Marcus was busy with work and never questioning why his schedule had become so demanding over the past few years. I thought about the nights I had gone to bed by myself, falling asleep before he came home, waking up the next morning to find him already gone for the day. I had attributed it all to the natural changes that come with age and long marriage, the way couples grow more independent and less physically affectionate as the years pass. But it hadn't been natural change. It had been deliberate distance, created by the fact that Marcus was getting his emotional and physical needs met somewhere else. Did you know about his heart problems? I asked suddenly, remembering the doctor's explanation about the massive heart attack that had killed him. Did he tell you he was having chest pains or shortness of breath? Rebecca's face crumpled, and fresh tears started flowing down her cheeks. He didn't want to worry you, she said. He'd been having symptoms for months, but he was afraid that if he went to the doctor, if something was seriously wrong, it would all come out. The affair, I mean. He was terrified that you would find out, so he chose to protect his secret rather than his life. He chose to risk dying rather than risk me discovering his betrayal. And in the end, the secret died with him anyway, because death has a way of exposing the things we try hardest to hide. I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my vision blur around the edges. Marcus had died because he was more concerned about covering up his affair than he was about his own health. He had left me widowed and alone and completely unprepared for the truth about our marriage, because he couldn't bear the thought of facing the consequences of his choices. He was a coward, I said, the words coming out harsher than I had intended, but no harsher than I felt them. He was a coward who chose to die rather than deal with the mess he had made. Rebecca looked up at me sharply, her tear-streaked face suddenly angry. "Don't say that," she said. "You don't understand what he was going through, how torn he was about everything. He loved us both and he didn't know how to choose." "He made his choice," I replied. "He chose you for 4 years. He chose to lie to me for 4 years. He chose to risk his life rather than tell me the truth. Those were his choices, and now I'm the one who has to live with the consequences." I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot where my car was waiting, at the normal world where people were going about their normal lives without having to confront the wreckage of their marriages in their dead husband's mistress's apartment. I thought about driving home to my empty house, to the pottery studio, where I would sit surrounded by half-finished pieces and wonder what the point of any of it was. I thought about the sympathy casseroles that were probably piling up in my refrigerator, brought by well-meaning neighbors who had no idea that my grief was complicated by betrayal and humiliation. I turned back to Rebecca, who was still sitting on the couch crying silently, and I realized that she was grieving too. She had lost someone she loved, someone who had been a significant part of her life for 4 years, and she couldn't even grieve publicly because their relationship had been a secret. She couldn't attend his funeral without causing a scene. She couldn't tell her friends and family about her loss without explaining the circumstances. She was as alone in her grief as I was in mine, maybe more so. But I didn't feel sorry for her, I couldn't. She had chosen to be the other woman, had chosen to participate in the deception, had chosen to accept the limitations and secrecy that came with loving someone else's husband. I hadn't chosen any of this. I had been an unwilling participant in a drama I didn't even know was being performed. "I'm selling the house," I said suddenly, the decision forming as I spoke the words. "I can't live there anymore, knowing what I know now. Everything feels contaminated." Rebecca looked up at me with something that might have been surprise, or concern, or fear. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life now that I know the last 27 years of it were built on lies. But I know I can't stay in that house, surrounded by memories that aren't what I thought they were." I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her one more time. "Did he ever talk about leaving you?" I asked. "Did he ever say he was going to end it and try to fix things with me?" Rebecca was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she said. "He talked about feeling guilty, about wishing things could be different. But he never talked about ending it. I think he would have kept going the way we were until one of us died." "Well," I said, "one of you did." I left her apartment and walked back to my car, feeling emptier than I had when I arrived. I hadn't gotten the satisfaction of confronting her that I had expected. I hadn't been able to make her feel the pain I was feeling, or somehow transfer my humiliation onto her shoulders. She was just another victim of Marcus's choices, another woman whose life had been shaped by his inability to deal honestly with his emotions and his marriage. But I had gotten answers, even if they weren't the answers I had wanted. I knew how long the affair had lasted, how it had started, how serious it had been. I knew that Marcus had loved her and that she had loved him back, and that knowledge was like carrying around a stone in my chest that got heavier every time I breathed. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods I had never explored, past houses where other people were living their lives and dealing with their own secrets and disappointments and small tragedies. I thought about the millions of women who had discovered their husbands' affairs over the centuries, who had been forced to confront the gap between the life they thought they were living and the life they were actually living. Some of them probably stayed and tried to rebuild, Some of them probably left and started over. Some of them probably spent the rest of their lives wondering what they could have done differently, what signs they had missed, what failures in themselves had driven their husbands to seek love elsewhere. But I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering. I didn't want to stay in our house and try to pretend that everything could go back to normal when normal had never been what I thought it was. And I didn't want to forgive Marcus for choices he had made that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life without my knowledge or consent. When I got home, I called a real estate agent. The house sold faster than I had expected, to a young couple with a new baby, who fell in love with the wraparound porch and the mature trees in the backyard. They had no idea that the master bedroom had been shared by a woman who thought she was happily married and a man who was living a double life. They had no idea that the kitchen had been the site of thousands of conversations that were built on a foundation of deception. They saw only the hardwood floors and the updated appliances and the potential for creating their own memories in the space where mine had been systematically destroyed. I felt sorry for them, in a way. Not because there was anything wrong with the house itself, but because I now knew how quickly the life you think you're building can be revealed to be something entirely different. I wanted to warn them somehow, to tell them to keep asking questions and paying attention and never assuming that love is enough to guarantee honesty. But they were young and excited and obviously in love with each other, in the way that comes before disappointment and compromise and the slow erosion of intimacy that time can bring to even the best relationships. They deserved to discover their own lessons without having mine imposed on them. The closing was scheduled for the first week of December, which gave me about 6 weeks to pack up 27 years of accumulated life and decide what was worth keeping and what could be left behind. I started with the easy things, the obviously personal items like my clothes and jewelry and the pottery I had made over the years. Then I moved on to the books and kitchen items and furniture that had clear emotional attachment or practical value. But then came the harder decisions. What do you do with wedding gifts when the marriage they celebrated turned out to be a lie? What do you do with family photos that include someone who is living a secret life? What do you do with Christmas ornaments that represent holidays you thought were happy but that were apparently tainted by ongoing deception? I found myself paralyzed by these choices, standing in rooms full of objects that had once held meaning and now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The china we had received as a wedding gift and used for every anniversary dinner. The painting we had bought together during our honeymoon in Maine. The comfortable reading chair where Marcus used to sit in the evenings, reading his mystery novels and occasionally reading interesting passages aloud to me. Everything was contaminated by the knowledge of his betrayal, but everything was also genuinely part of my life. Part of the woman I had been before I knew the truth. Throwing it all away felt like erasing myself along with the marriage, but keeping it felt like holding on to a lie. I was standing in Marcus's office, staring at the bookcases full of construction manuals and business records, when I found the second envelope. It was tucked behind a row of thick technical books, hidden even more carefully than the first one, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking so badly I had to sit down. Inside were legal documents. Copies of a lease agreement for Rebecca's apartment, with Marcus listed as a co-signer. Bank statements for an account I had never known existed, an account that Marcus had been using to pay her rent and utilities, and what looked like a monthly allowance. Receipts for jewelry and flowers, and weekend trips to places I had never been, places they had visited together while I thought he was working. And at the bottom of the envelope, a copy of a will that wasn't the will I had seen when we had our estate planning done 5 years ago. This will, dated just 6 months before Marcus's death, left a significant portion of his assets to Rebecca Walsh, including his share of the construction business, and a substantial cash bequest that would have guaranteed her financial security for the rest of her life. I stared at the document for a long time, reading it over and over again, trying to understand what it meant. Marcus had been planning to leave me money, enough to maintain the house and live comfortably, but he had also been planning to leave Rebecca enough to ensure that she would never have to worry about money again. He had been supporting her financially while he was alive, and he had planned to continue supporting her after his death. The will had never been properly executed, which meant it wasn't legally binding, which meant that everything had come to me as his legal spouse. But the intent was clear. Marcus had been planning to divide his life's work between the woman he was married to and the woman he loved. And he had been doing it without telling either of us what he was planning. I called the lawyer who had handled our estate planning, a kind older man named Howard Brennan, who had been dealing with our legal affairs for over a decade. I made an appointment to see him the next day, bringing with me the secret will and the bank statements, and all the evidence of the financial double life that Marcus had been living. Howard read through everything with the careful attention that comes from 40 years of practicing law, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or disapproval. When he finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes in the way that people do when they're trying to process something difficult. "I'm sorry, Alma," he said. "I had no idea Marcus was contemplating changes to your estate plan. If I had known about any of this, I would have insisted that you be present for all discussions. Is it legal?" I asked. What he was doing with the money, I mean. Can someone just set up secret bank accounts and support another woman without their spouse knowing? Howard sighed. "It's complicated," he said. "Technically, since you weren't aware of these financial arrangements, they could be considered a form of financial infidelity. If you had divorced, a court might have ordered him to repay the marital estate for money that was spent on his affair. But since he's deceased and you've inherited everything, it's largely a moot point from a legal perspective." "But not from a personal perspective," I said. "No," he agreed. "Not from a personal perspective." I left Howard's office with a clearer understanding of the legal implications of Marcus's secret financial life, but with even more questions about who my husband had actually been. The man I had married wouldn't have hidden money from me. The man I had married wouldn't have made major financial decisions without consulting me. The man I had married wouldn't have planned to leave a significant portion of his assets to another woman without at least preparing me for that possibility. But apparently, the man I had married had ceased to exist years ago, replaced by someone I didn't know and never would have recognized. I spent the next few weeks packing mechanically, sorting through the debris of my former life and trying to decide what pieces of it were worth carrying forward. I kept some things because they predated Marcus, because they belonged to the woman I had been before I met him, and might help me remember who that woman was. I kept other things because they represented the parts of our marriage that had been real, even if the overall foundation had been false. But I left behind more than I kept. I left behind the furniture we had chosen together, and the dishes we had eaten from, and the books we had both read. I left behind the garden I had tended for 27 years, and the pottery studio I had built in the basement, and the master bedroom where I had slept next to a man who was dreaming about someone else. On the day before the closing, I walked through the empty house one last time, my footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been full of life and conversation, and the comfortable routine of a long marriage. I stood in the kitchen where Marcus and I had shared thousands of meals together, and I tried to remember what it had felt like to believe we were happy. I stood in the living room where we had watched television and read books and decorated Christmas trees and celebrated anniversaries, and I tried to understand how I had been so wrong about everything. But mostly, I felt relief. I was leaving behind not just the house, but the woman I had been when I lived in it. The woman who had been content to live a small, quiet life without asking too many questions, or demanding too much attention, or expecting more than comfortable routine from the person she loved most in the world. That woman had been betrayed and deceived and taken for granted, but she had also been complacent and passive, and perhaps too willing to accept surface-level contentment instead of demanding deeper connection. I wasn't proud of either version of the story, but I was grateful to be leaving both of them behind. I locked the door for the last time and walked to my car, which was packed with everything I owned that still mattered to me. I had rented a small apartment across town, a place that had never housed any memories or secrets or disappointed expectations. It was a blank slate, a place where I could figure out who I was going to be now that I knew who I had been before. As I drove away from Maple Street, I realized I wasn't thinking about Marcus or Rebecca or the marriage I was leaving behind. I was thinking about the future, about the woman I might become if I had the courage to build a life that was entirely my own, based on choices I made for myself, rather than choices that were made for me by people who thought they knew what was best. I was thinking about revenge, but not the kind that involves confrontation, or public humiliation, or trying to hurt the people who had hurt me. I was thinking about the kind of revenge that involves living well, that involves becoming more than the sum of the betrayals that had been inflicted on me, that involves refusing to let other people's choices define the rest of my story. And that's when I remembered the foreclosure notice. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had moved into my new apartment on the other side of town. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, still getting used to the unfamiliar sounds of different neighbors and traffic patterns, when my phone buzzed with a text message from my former next-door neighbor, Patricia Henley. "Alma, thought you should know there's an official-looking notice taped to the door at 847 Cedarwood Drive. Looks like foreclosure papers. Wasn't sure if you'd want to know, but figured you might. Hope you're doing well, dear." I stared at the message for a long moment, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Patricia had no idea why I would care about a foreclosure notice at an address she had probably never heard me mention. She was just being her usual, thoughtful self, the kind of neighbor who noticed things and looked out for people even when they had moved away. But what Patricia didn't know was that 847 Cedarwood Drive was Rebecca Walsh's address, and that the foreclosure notice probably meant that the financial support Marcus had been providing her was no longer sustainable without his income. I set down my phone and walked to the window of my new apartment, looking out at a view that still felt foreign to me. Everything here was different from the life I had left behind. The parking lot instead of a garden, the sound of highway traffic instead of birds in the oak trees, the smell of other people's cooking instead of the familiar sense of my own kitchen. I had chosen this apartment precisely because it was different, because it held no memories and no expectations, because it was a place where I could start over without the weight of the past pressing down on me every time I walked through the door. But Rebecca Walsh's financial troubles were still connected to my past, still tangled up with Marcus's choices and the secret life he had been living. According to the bank statements I had found in his office, he had been paying her rent for the past 2 years, along with utilities and what appeared to be a generous monthly allowance. Without that support, she was apparently unable to maintain the lifestyle he had been financing. I should have felt satisfied. This was justice of a sort. The natural consequence of building your life around someone else's stolen money and borrowed time. Rebecca had chosen to be dependent on a married man, and now she was facing the reality of what happens when that arrangement comes to an end. She had gambled on a future with Marcus, and she had lost. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something more complicated. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition that both of us had been living on the foundation of Marcus's lies, and both of us were now dealing with the collapse of the structures he had built to keep his two worlds separate. She was losing her apartment and her financial security, but I had lost my sense of reality, and my trust in my own judgment, and my belief that the life I had been living for 27 years had been real. I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on unpacking the boxes that still lined the walls of my new apartment, but my mind kept drifting back to that foreclosure notice. I imagined Rebecca receiving the legal papers, reading the formal language that would give her 30 days to bring her mortgage current or face eviction. I imagined her realizing that whatever financial arrangements Marcus had made for her future were no longer accessible, that she was on her own in a way she probably hadn't been for the past 4 years. By afternoon, I had given up on pretending I could concentrate on anything else. I drove across town to Cedarwood Drive, telling myself I was just curious, that I wanted to see for myself what Patricia had described. But deep down I knew I was going back to confront something I hadn't finished confronting the first time I had been there. The foreclosure notice was exactly where Patricia had said it would be, taped to the front door of the apartment building in a manila envelope marked with official seals and legal warnings. I sat in my car in the same parking spot I had occupied weeks earlier, staring at that envelope and thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Marcus dies of a heart attack, brought on partly by the stress of maintaining his secret life. I inherit his assets and discover his betrayal. Rebecca loses her financial support and faces foreclosure. And somewhere in this sequence of causes and effects, I was supposed to figure out how to move forward with my life. I was still sitting there an hour later when Rebecca's car pulled into the parking lot. She looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from dealing with problems that have no good solutions. She was carrying grocery bags and what looked like a stack of mail, and she walked slowly toward the building like someone who was dreading what she might find when she got inside. She saw me before she reached the door, and our eyes met across the parking lot in a moment of recognition that neither of us had been expecting. For a few seconds we just looked at each other, two women whose lives had been shaped by the same man's choices. and I could see in her face the same mixture of resignation and anger that I had been carrying around for weeks. She walked over to my car and I rolled down the window, though neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she gestured toward the foreclosure notice on the door. "I suppose you know about that," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "I heard," I replied. "I'm sorry." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you? Are you really sorry? Or are you here to see the results of your husband's death?" The accusation stung because there was some truth to it. I wasn't entirely sorry that Rebecca was facing consequences for her choices. I wasn't entirely sorry that the comfortable life Marcus had built for her was falling apart. But I also wasn't here to gloat or to watch her suffer, and the fact that she thought I might be said something about how she viewed me, how she viewed the whole situation. "I'm not here to watch you suffer," I said. "I'm trying to understand something." "What's to understand?" she asked. "Marcus is dead, the money he was giving me stopped coming, and now I'm losing my apartment. It's pretty straightforward." "Why didn't you save anything?" I asked. "In 4 years, why didn't you put aside enough money to support yourself when this arrangement ended?" Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, and I could see anger building behind her eyes. "You think I was just living off your husband's money like some kind of kept woman," she said. "You think I was sitting around eating bonbons and getting my nails done while he paid all my bills. Weren't you?" "I worked," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I work. I'm a freelance graphic designer, and I have clients, and I earn money." But Marcus insisted on covering the big expenses because he said he wanted to take care of me. He said it made him feel good to know I was secure, that I didn't have to worry about rent or utilities or car payments. She shifted the grocery bags to her other arm, and I could see that her hands were shaking slightly. "And yes, I let him. I let him pay for things because it made our relationship feel more real somehow, more like a real partnership instead of just an affair. But I kept working, and I kept trying to build my own career, and I kept thinking that someday we would figure out how to make this work in a way that didn't involve so much secrecy and deception. But that day never came," I said. "No," she agreed, "that day never came. And now I'm stuck with a lease he co-signed, and expenses he was covering, and a lifestyle I can't maintain on my own income. And you're stuck with the knowledge that your husband was living a double life. So I guess we're both paying for his choices now." I looked at her standing there in the parking lot, holding her groceries and her mail, and what was probably a stack of bills she couldn't pay, and I realized that Rebecca Walsh wasn't the villain I had wanted her to be. She was just another woman who had made compromises and accepted half-truths, and convinced herself that love was enough to justify questionable choices. She was just another woman who had trusted a man who turned out to be different from who she thought he was. "What will you do?" I asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have 30 days to figure something out. Maybe I can find a smaller place, something I can afford on my own. Maybe I can pick up more freelance work. Maybe I can move back to Portland and start over again." She paused, looking toward the building where she had lived for 4 years, where she had built a life with my husband. "What about you? What are you going to do with the rest of your life now that you know the truth?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself every day since Marcus's funeral. I had sold my house and moved to a new apartment and tried to create physical distance from the life I had been living. But I hadn't figured out what came next. I hadn't figured out how to build a future on the ruins of a past that had turned out to be largely fictional. "I don't know either," I said. "I'm 61 years old, and I feel like I'm starting over from scratch. I don't know who I am when I'm not Marcus's wife, when I'm not living the life he wanted me to live." Rebecca nodded, and for a moment I felt a strange kinship with this woman who had been my husband's lover. We were both starting over, both trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives after the foundation had been pulled out from under us. We were both dealing with the aftermath of loving a man who had been incapable of honesty, who had chosen comfort and avoidance over the difficult work of authentic relationships. "I should go," she said, shifting the grocery bags again. "I need to make some phone calls, see if I can work something out with the mortgage company." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Alma," she said, using my name for the first time since I had known who she was. "For what it's worth, he did love you. He talked about you all the time, about how good you were, how patient and kind and understanding. He felt terrible about what he was doing to you, even if he couldn't bring himself to stop doing it. That doesn't make it better, I said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But I thought you should know that you weren't just an obligation to him. You were never just an obligation. I watched her walk into the building, carrying her groceries and her problems and the weight of a relationship that had never had a chance to be anything more than a secret. I sat in my car for a while longer, thinking about what she had said, about Marcus feeling terrible but continuing to lie anyway, about being loved and betrayed simultaneously. When I finally drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the foreclosure notice and what it represented. Rebecca was losing her apartment because she had built her life around money that wasn't really hers, around support that could be withdrawn without warning, around promises that had never been officially made. But in a way, wasn't that exactly what I had been doing too? Hadn't I built my life around assumptions that turned out to be false? Around promises that Marcus had never explicitly made? Around a marriage that existed more in my imagination than in reality? The difference was that I had inherited Marcus's actual assets, while Rebecca had inherited only the debt and disappointment of their secret relationship. I had legal claim to the money he had earned during our marriage, while she had moral claim to the love he had given her during their affair. Neither of us had gotten what we thought we were going to get, but the law was clearly on my side in ways that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the accident of legal marriage. That night I lay in my new bed in my new apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about fairness and revenge and what I owed to the woman who had been sharing my husband for 4 years. I didn't owe her anything, legally or morally. She had made her choices just as I had made mine, and the consequences of those choices were hers to deal with. But I kept thinking about the foreclosure notice, about the 30-day deadline, about the fact that she was about to lose her home because of circumstances that were largely outside her control now that Marcus was dead. I thought about the money that Marcus had been giving her, money that had technically belonged to both of us as a married couple. I thought about the will he had secretly written, leaving her a substantial inheritance that would have solved all her current problems if it had been legally executed. I thought about the fact that I now had access to all of Marcus's assets, including money that had been intended for another woman. Money that I would never miss because I had never known it existed in the first place. And I thought about revenge, the real kind, the kind that doesn't involve hurting someone but involves becoming someone better than the person who hurt you. The idea came to me slowly, over the course of several sleepless nights. It started as just a vague notion of doing something unexpected, something that would surprise everyone, including myself. But gradually it took shape, becoming a plan that was both generous and selfish, both kind and calculating, both practical and completely insane. I was going to buy Rebecca Walsh's apartment building, not to save her, exactly, and not to hurt her either, but to take control of a situation that had been controlling me, to make a choice that was entirely my own, instead of simply reacting to choices that other people had made for me. I was going to use Marcus's money that he had been secretly diverting to support his affair, to purchase the building where that affair had taken place. And then I was going to decide what happened next, on my own terms, according to my own sense of what was right and fair and appropriate. It was a ridiculous idea. I had never owned rental property, had no experience as a landlord, and no clear plan for what I would do with an apartment building once I owned it. But it was my ridiculous idea, my choice to make, my way of taking control of a situation that had been imposed on me by people who had never asked for my input or consent. The next morning I called Howard Brennan, my lawyer, and asked him to research the ownership of 847 Cedarwood Drive. Within a few hours he called me back with information that made my plan seem less ridiculous and more possible. The building was owned by a small real estate investment company that was apparently in financial trouble. Several of the apartments were vacant, and the owner was behind on property taxes and struggling to maintain the building. Rebecca's apartment was one of only 3 units that were currently occupied, and the foreclosure notice I had seen was actually for the entire building, not just her individual unit. "It looks like the owner is motivated to sell," Howard told me. "The building is probably worth more than they're asking, but they need to liquidate quickly to avoid losing everything to back taxes and mortgage payments." "How much?" I asked. He named a figure that was substantial but well within my means, given the assets I had inherited from Marcus. It would use up a significant portion of my available cash, but it wouldn't leave me struggling financially. And according to the rental income from the occupied units, the building could potentially pay for itself over time if it was properly managed. "Are you serious about this, Alma?" Howard asked. "Because buying rental property is a big responsibility, especially a building that needs work and better management." "I'm serious," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was serious about. I was serious about taking control of something, about making a choice that was mine, rather than accepting circumstances that had been created by other people's deceptions. Whether that constituted a good reason to buy an apartment building was something I would figure out later. "I'll need to have the building inspected," I continued. "And I'll need to understand the current lease agreements and the financial obligations. But if everything checks out, yes, I want to make an offer." Howard was quiet for a moment, and I could tell he was trying to decide whether to talk me out of what might be an impulsive decision made during a difficult time in my life. Finally, he said, "All right, let me make some calls and see what we can find out. But Alma, I want you to think carefully about your motivations here. Revenge purchases rarely turn out the way people expect them to." "This isn't revenge," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "This is reclamation." The building inspection revealed what I had expected: a fundamentally sound structure that had been neglected by an absentee owner who was more interested in collecting rent than maintaining the property. The roof needed minor repairs, the heating system needed updating, and several of the vacant apartments needed new flooring and fresh paint before they could be rented again. But none of these problems were insurmountable, and the total cost of bringing the building up to standard was well within my budget. The current tenants were a mix of young professionals and retirees, people who had chosen the building for its location and reasonable rent rather than its amenities. Rebecca was actually paying above market rate for her apartment, probably because Marcus had been willing to cover whatever the landlord demanded rather than negotiate or look for alternatives. I made an offer that was accepted within 24 hours, and suddenly I was the owner of a 12-unit apartment building that included the home where my dead husband had been carrying on his affair for 4 years. It was possibly the strangest real estate transaction in the history of suburban development, but it was mine, and for the first time since Marcus's funeral, I felt like I was doing something rather than just surviving something. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday, which gave Rebecca exactly 3 days before her foreclosure deadline. I had instructed Howard not to reveal my identity as the new owner until after all the paperwork was signed, partly because I wanted to avoid complications during the purchase process, and partly because I hadn't decided what I was going to say to her when she found out. On Thursday evening, the night before the closing, I drove to Cedarwood Drive one more time. The foreclosure notice was still taped to the front door, faded now from rain and sun but still legally binding. Several of the apartment windows were dark, and the parking lot had the slightly abandoned feel of a place where people were already starting to move on. I sat in my car and tried to imagine what it would feel like to own this building, to be responsible for the lives and comfort of the people who lived here, to be the person who decided who could stay and who had to go. I thought about Rebecca, probably inside her apartment packing boxes and making arrangements and preparing to leave the life she had built with Marcus. I thought about the other tenants, who had no idea that their building had changed hands, and that their lives were about to be affected by the personal drama of people they had never met. And I thought about Marcus, who had paid Rebecca's rent for 2 years without my knowledge, who had made financial commitments on behalf of our marriage without consulting me, who had tied our financial future to his secret relationship in ways I was still discovering. He was dead, but his choices were still shaping the lives of everyone involved in this situation, still creating consequences that would ripple forward for months or years to come. The closing the next morning was purely business, a series of signatures and wire transfers and legal documents that officially transferred ownership from the distressed investment company to me. Howard handled most of the details while I sat in the lawyer's conference room, signing papers and trying to process the fact that I was now a landlord, a property owner, a person with responsibilities I had never imagined having. When it was over, Howard handed me a set of keys and a folder full of lease agreements and contact information for the current tenants. "Congratulations," he said, though his tone suggested he still wasn't sure whether congratulations were appropriate. "You're now the owner of 847 Cedarwood Drive." I drove to the building immediately after leaving the lawyer's office, parked in what was now my parking lot, and walked up to the front door. I unlocked it with my new key and stepped into the lobby, which was small and functional but not particularly welcoming. The carpet was worn, and the lighting was dim, and there was a bulletin board covered with notices about package deliveries and maintenance schedules. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and stood outside apartment 2B, Rebecca's door, holding the master key that would let me into the space where Marcus had been living his secret life. I could hear movement inside, the sound of boxes being dragged across the floor, and drawers being opened and closed. She was packing, preparing to leave, assuming that the foreclosure would force her out by the end of the weekend. I knocked on the door, and the sounds inside stopped immediately. After a moment, Rebecca's voice came through the door, cautious and tired. "Who is it?" "It's Alma Bennett," I said. "I need to talk to you." The door opened slowly, and Rebecca appeared wearing old jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Behind her, I could see boxes stacked in the living room and packing tapes scattered across the coffee table. She looked like someone who had been crying recently, but who was trying to maintain her composure in the face of an unexpected visitor. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I held up the keyring, letting her see the apartment building keys along with my car keys and house key. "I bought the building," I said. "As of this morning, I'm your new landlord." Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been anger. "You what?" "I bought the building," I repeated. "The foreclosure has been resolved, the back payments have been made, and the building is now under new management." "Mine?" She stepped back into her apartment, and I followed her inside without being invited. The space looked different, with boxes everywhere, and furniture moved away from the walls. Less like a home and more like a storage unit. The personal touches that had made it feel like a place where Marcus belonged were now packed away, or sitting in boxes marked for donation. "Why?" Rebecca asked, and I could hear the strain in her voice. "Why would you buy this building? Why would you want to be my landlord?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself for the past week. Why had I done this? Was it revenge, an elaborate way of making Rebecca's life more complicated by inserting myself into it permanently? Was it control, a way of having power over the woman who had been sharing my husband? Was it justice, a way of using Marcus's money for something he never would have expected? Or was it something else entirely? Something I didn't fully understand yet, but that felt like the first authentic choice I had made in years. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know why I bought this building, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it now that I own it. But I know that I was tired of other people making decisions that affected my life without asking me what I wanted." Rebecca sat down heavily on her couch, which was now surrounded by boxes and packing materials. "So you decided to make a decision that affects my life without asking me what I want?" "Yes," I said. "I suppose I did." We sat in silence for a while, two women in an apartment where one woman's husband had betrayed his marriage, and the other woman had participated in that betrayal, now connected by property ownership and shared grief and the complicated legacy of a man who had been incapable of choosing between the two lives he was living. Finally, Rebecca looked up at me. "What happens now?" she asked. "Are you going to evict me? Are you going to raise my rent to force me out? Are you going to make my life miserable until I move away and you never have to see me again?" I looked around the apartment where Marcus had spent so much time, where he had been happy in ways that apparently he hadn't been happy at home, where he had built a relationship that was real and meaningful even though it was also dishonest and destructive. I thought about the rent he had been paying for this space, the money he had been diverting from our marriage to support this life, the choices he had made that had led to this moment. "I don't know," I said again. "I honestly don't know what happens now. But I know what's not going to happen. You're not being evicted, and your rent isn't being raised, and I'm not here to make your life miserable." Rebecca studied my face, looking for signs that I was lying or manipulating or setting her up for some elaborate form of revenge. "Then what do you want from me?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering, because I wasn't sure I knew the answer myself. What did I want from the woman who had been my husband's lover? What did I want from this building, from this situation, from this strange new role I had created for myself? I want to understand, I said finally. I want to understand how my marriage became something I didn't recognize. I want to understand how you and Marcus built something real together while he was lying to both of us about what your future was going to look like. I want to understand how I'm supposed to move forward when everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be wrong. And you think owning this building is going to help you understand that? I think making choices is going to help me understand that, I said. I think taking control of something instead of just reacting to things is going to help me understand that. And right now, this building and your situation are the only things I have any control over. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, looking around her apartment at the evidence of a life being dismantled, at the boxes that contained 4 years of memories and possessions, and the physical artifacts of a relationship that had never been allowed to exist in daylight. I can't afford the rent without Marcus's help, she said finally. Even if you're not raising it, even if you're not evicting me, I can't afford to stay here on what I make from freelance work. Then we'll figure something out, I said. Maybe you can take over some of the management responsibilities for the building in exchange for reduced rent. Maybe you can help with the renovations that need to be done on the vacant units. Maybe we can work out a payment plan that lets you stay while you build up your business. Why would you do that? She asked. Why would you help the woman who was sleeping with your husband? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where I had sat in my car so many times over the past month, trying to understand my life and my choices, and the woman I was becoming. I could see my Honda parked in the same spot where I had first discovered Rebecca's existence, where I had first started to question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Because, I said, turning back to face her, you're not the only one who lost someone when Marcus died. And you're not the only one who's trying to figure out what comes next, when the life you were living turns out to have been built on someone else's lies. I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back one more time. You have 30 days to decide what you want to do, I said. Stay and we'll work something out. Leave and I'll give you the security deposit and a good reference for your next place. But either way, the choice is yours to make. I left her apartment and walked back down to the lobby of my building, the building where my husband had been living a secret life for 4 years. I stood in the small entryway, looking at the mailboxes and the bulletin board and the worn carpet, and I realized that I had just made the first entirely independent decision of my adult life. For 27 years, my choices had been filtered through my marriage, shaped by what Marcus wanted or needed or expected from me. For 61 years, my choices had been shaped by what other people wanted or expected from me. But buying this building, offering Rebecca a chance to stay, creating this strange new relationship with the woman who had been my husband's lover, these were choices that belonged to me alone. I didn't know if they were good choices or bad choices, smart choices or foolish choices. But they were mine, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough. 2 years after Marcus's death, I received an invitation that changed everything I thought I knew about endings and beginnings. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, mixed in with utility bills and property management correspondence, in an envelope addressed to Mrs. Alma Bennett in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a wedding invitation, elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering, announcing the marriage of Rebecca Walsh to David Chen, a software engineer she had met through one of her design clients. I stared at the invitation for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table in the apartment that had become truly mine, surrounded by the organized chaos of running a growing business. Rebecca was getting married, moving forward with her life in a way that felt both surprising and inevitable. She had found someone who wanted to build a future with her openly, someone who saw her as a priority rather than a secret, someone who offered her the kind of honest partnership that Marcus had never been capable of providing to anyone. The wedding was scheduled for late September, in a small venue downtown that specialized in intimate ceremonies. At the bottom of the invitation, someone had written in the same unfamiliar handwriting, "Alma, I know this might seem strange, but your friendship has meant everything to Rebecca during this healing process. She would be honored if you would consider attending. David is excited to meet the woman who helped Rebecca rebuild her life. RSVP to this number if you're willing to celebrate with us." I set the invitation aside and tried to focus on the stack of contractor estimates I needed to review for the newest property in my portfolio, a historic building that I was converting into luxury lofts. But my mind kept drifting back to the idea of attending Rebecca's wedding, to the strange symmetry of witnessing her marry someone else in the same year I had finally stopped wearing my own wedding ring. The ring had come off 6 months earlier, not in a dramatic moment of declaration but during an ordinary evening when I was washing dishes, and noticed how loose it had become. I had lost weight without meaning to, a consequence of being more active and engaged with my life than I had been in years. The ring slipped off easily, and instead of pushing it back into place, I had set it on the windowsill and left it there. It sat in that spot for 3 weeks before I moved it to the jewelry box where it now lived alongside other artifacts from my previous life. I called Rebecca that evening, using the number at the bottom of the invitation. "I wasn't sure you would call," she said when she heard my voice. "I know it's an unusual request." "Congratulations," I said. "Tell me about him." "Tell me about David." Rebecca's voice brightened in a way I had rarely heard during the years we had worked together. "He's kind," she said. "Genuinely kind, not just polite or well-mannered, but actually concerned about other people's well-being. He makes me laugh without meaning to, and he listens when I talk about my work like it's the most fascinating thing he's ever heard. He's never been married before, so there's no baggage, no ex-wife to compare myself to." She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "And Alma, he knows everything. About Marcus, about the affair, about how we met and what happened afterward. I told him all of it before we got serious, and he didn't run away. He said everyone has a past, and he was more interested in who I was becoming than who I had been." "That sounds wonderful," I said, and I meant it. Whatever complicated feelings I had about Rebecca's relationship with Marcus, I genuinely wanted her to be happy, to find the kind of partnership that was built on honesty rather than deception. "Will you come?" she asked. "I know it's weird to invite your dead husband's widow to your wedding, but you've been such an important part of my journey toward healing. David says he wants to meet the woman who taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that strength sometimes looks like choosing grace over revenge." I thought about all the ways my life had changed since that terrible morning when I discovered Rebecca sitting in my seat at Marcus's funeral. I thought about the woman I had been then, devastated and humiliated and completely unprepared for the truth about her marriage. That woman would never have imagined attending her husband's mistress's wedding, would never have been capable of celebrating the happiness of someone who had participated in her betrayal. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who had learned that healing doesn't require holding on to anger, that moving forward doesn't require anyone else to stay behind, that forgiveness is sometimes less about the person who hurt you and more about the person you want to become. "I'll be there," I said. The wedding was small and elegant, held in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the space with golden afternoon light. Rebecca wore a simple ivory dress and carried a bouquet of white peonies, and she looked genuinely radiant in the way that only comes from knowing that you're exactly where you're supposed to be with exactly the right person. David was tall and quiet, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly awkward charm of someone who was more comfortable with computers than crowds. But when he looked at Rebecca, his whole face lit up, and when they exchanged vows, he spoke about loving her past and her present, and being excited to discover her future. I sat in the back, an unexpected guest at an unlikely celebration, and found myself crying during the ceremony. Not from sadness or regret, or any lingering pain about Marcus and the choices he had made, but from joy at witnessing two people commit to building something honest and real together. It was the kind of wedding Marcus and I had never had, the kind of partnership we had never achieved, and seeing it reminded me that some stories do have happy endings, even when they begin in the most unlikely circumstances. During the reception, Rebecca introduced me to David as the woman who saved my life by buying my building and giving me a chance to prove I was more than my worst mistake. David shook my hand with obvious respect and thanked me for helping Rebecca find her way back to herself. "She talks about you all the time," he said. "About what you taught her about running a business, about standing up for herself, about the difference between surviving something and actually healing from it. I think meeting you changed her whole understanding of what strength looks like." "She changed my understanding too," I replied. "She helped me learn that sometimes the people who hurt us aren't villains. Sometimes they're just other people trying to find their way, making the best decisions they can with limited information and complicated emotions. Later, during the dancing, Rebecca found me at my table and sat down beside me. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know it couldn't have been easy." "It was easier than I expected," I said honestly. "I'm happy for you. Really, genuinely happy. You deserve this kind of love, this kind of partnership." "So do you," she said quietly. "I know you've built an amazing life on your own, and I know you're proud of your independence. But Alma, you deserve someone who sees all of you and chooses all of you, someone who wants to build something with you instead of keeping parts of himself separate." I smiled at this woman who had been my husband's lover and was now my friend, offering me advice about love and relationships from her own hard-won wisdom. "Maybe someday," I said, "but right now I'm still learning how to be in a relationship with myself. I'm still discovering who I am when I'm not defined by my connection to someone else. For the first time in my adult life, I'm completely responsible for my own happiness, and that's both terrifying and exhilarating." "I understand that," Rebecca said. "I spent 4 years being someone's secret, and then another year learning how to be my own person before I was ready to be David's partner. There's something powerful about knowing that you can be complete on your own, that choosing to be with someone is a gift you give rather than a need you fill." We sat together watching the other guests dance, 2 women who had been shaped by the same man's inability to choose between the life he had and the life he wanted, who had somehow found their way to friendship and mutual respect, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Can I tell you something?" Rebecca said as the evening was winding down. "Something I've never told anyone?" I nodded. "I used to be jealous of you," she said. "Not just because you were Marcus's wife, but because you seemed so sure of yourself, so confident in your place in the world. Even when you came to my apartment that first time, even when you were angry and hurt and confused, you carried yourself like someone who knew her own worth." "I didn't feel that way," I said. "I felt lost and insignificant and completely out of my depth." "But you acted with dignity anyway," Rebecca continued. "You could have made my life hell. You could have told everyone in town about the affair, could have made sure I lost clients or friends or any chance of building a respectable life here. Instead, you chose to understand rather than condemn, to build rather than destroy." She paused, looking across the room at David, who was helping to stack chairs and clean up after the reception. "You taught me that strength doesn't have to be harsh," she said. "That you can be powerful without being cruel. That you can protect yourself without destroying other people." That lesson changed how I approach everything now, including how I love David. I don't love him desperately or possessively or like I need him to complete me. I love him clearly and generously and from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. "That's the best kind of love," I said. "It's the only kind worth having," she agreed. I drove home that night thinking about second chances and new beginnings, about the strange ways that life sometimes offers healing in the most unexpected packages. Rebecca's wedding had been a celebration not just of her future with David, but of her journey back to herself, her discovery that she was worthy of honest love and open partnership. It had also been a reminder of my own journey, of how far I had come from the woman who had stood in the back of Marcus's funeral, feeling like a stranger in her own life. That woman had been defined entirely by her relationship to other people, had measured her worth by how well she fulfilled their expectations and needs. The woman driving home from Rebecca's wedding was defined by her own choices and achievements, measured her worth by how authentically she lived and how generously she contributed to the world around her. The following month brought an opportunity that tested everything I had learned about taking risks and trusting my instincts. A commercial real estate developer approached me about partnering on a major renovation project, converting an abandoned department store into mixed-use space with retail on the ground floor and luxury apartments above. It would be by far the largest project I had ever undertaken, requiring a substantial financial investment and partnerships with contractors and architects and city planners I had never worked with before. The smart, safe choice would have been to decline the offer, to stick with the smaller residential properties I knew how to manage effectively. But the woman I had become was no longer interested in smart, safe choices. She was interested in growth and challenge, and the satisfaction of building something significant. I spent 2 weeks analyzing the financial projections, touring the building with structural engineers, and meeting with potential partners. The project was complex and risky, but it was also exactly the kind of opportunity I had been unconsciously preparing for during my years of learning property management and business development. On a crisp October morning, I signed the partnership agreement that committed me to the largest business venture of my life. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, I thought about Marcus and how he would have reacted to this decision. He would have been nervous about the risk, concerned about the potential for failure, focused on all the things that could go wrong rather than the possibilities for success. But Marcus's opinion no longer mattered, no longer influenced my choices, or shaped my confidence in my own judgment. I was making this decision based on my own analysis, and my own appetite for risk, and my own vision of what I wanted to build with the rest of my life. The renovation project took 18 months and consumed most of my time and energy and financial resources. There were setbacks and surprises and moments when I wondered if I had overreached, if I had let ambition override prudence. But there were also breakthrough moments when everything came together perfectly, when I could see the vision becoming reality, when I felt the deep satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful from something abandoned and forgotten. The grand opening was held on a sunny Saturday in April, 3 years and 6 months after Marcus's death. The ground floor retail spaces were fully leased to a mix of boutiques and restaurants and specialty shops. The apartments upstairs were already 90% occupied with a waiting list for future vacancies. The project had exceeded all financial projections and established my development company as a serious player in the regional commercial real estate market. I stood in the central atrium during the opening celebration, surrounded by tenants and partners and city officials and members of the Phoenix Society who had come to support me, and I felt something I had never experienced before: complete and absolute pride in my own accomplishment. Not pride mixed with gratitude for someone else's help or support, not pride tempered by awareness of how lucky I had been, but pure satisfaction in what I had achieved through my own vision and effort and determination. Rebecca and David were there, having driven down from their new home in a neighboring city where David had taken a job with a tech startup, and Rebecca was building a design consultancy that specialized in commercial spaces. She found me during a quiet moment and gave me a hug that felt like a benediction. "This is incredible," she said, looking around at the bustling crowd and the beautiful spaces I had helped create. Marcus would be amazed. "No," I said with a smile. Marcus would be worried about the mortgage payments and the maintenance costs and whether I was taking on too much responsibility. This isn't something Marcus would have supported. This is something I did despite Marcus, not because of him. "Even better," Rebecca laughed. "This is something you did because of who you discovered you were when you stopped being who he needed you to be." As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, I walked through the empty building, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure. In 18 months, this space had been transformed from a forgotten relic into a vibrant community gathering place. But the transformation of the building was nothing compared to the transformation of the woman who had envisioned and executed the project. I was 65 years old and running a multi-million-dollar development company. I employed 12 people full-time and dozens more as contractors and consultants. I owned 7 properties and had partnerships with major developers and architects throughout the region. I served on the board of directors for 2 nonprofits and mentored young women who were starting their own businesses. More importantly, I was happy. Not the quiet contentment I had mistaken for happiness during my marriage, but active, engaged joy in my daily life and excitement about my future plans. I woke up every morning eager to tackle the challenges of the day, to solve problems and make decisions and build things that would outlast me. I had also, much to my own surprise, started dating. His name was James Morrison, and he was a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. We met at a city planning meeting where we were both advocating for different approaches to downtown development, and our professional disagreement had somehow evolved into personal conversation, and eventually dinner, and then a relationship that was unlike anything I had experienced before. James knew about Marcus and the affair, and the way my marriage had ended. I had told him everything during our 3rd date, expecting him to be put off by the complexity and drama of my story. Instead, he had listened carefully and then said that he was impressed by how I had handled an impossible situation. how I had found ways to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than seek revenge. Most people who get betrayed that completely either collapse or become bitter, he said. You became stronger. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. James was different from Marcus in every way that mattered. He was direct rather than evasive, emotionally available rather than compartmentalized, interested in building something together rather than maintaining separate worlds. He was also a successful businessman in his own right, which meant that our relationship was a partnership of equals, rather than one person supporting or depending on the other. We had been together for 8 months when he proposed, not with a grand romantic gesture, but during a quiet dinner at my apartment, when we were discussing our shared dreams for the future. I want to build something with you, he said simply. Not because either of us needs rescuing or completing, but because what we could create together would be better than what either of us could create alone. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, because it was based on reality rather than fantasy, on mutual respect rather than desperate need, on the recognition that we were both complete people choosing to combine our strengths rather than incomplete people trying to fill each other's gaps. I said yes, but not immediately. I asked for time to think, not because I wasn't sure about James, but because I wanted to be certain that I was choosing marriage for the right reasons. The last time I had gotten married, I had been young and romantic, and convinced that love was enough to guarantee happiness. This time, I was older and wiser and aware that successful partnerships require much more than love. But after a month of careful consideration, I realized that James and I had everything that Marcus and I had lacked: honest communication, shared values, mutual respect, and a genuine interest in each other's success and well-being. We challenged each other without trying to change each other, supported each other without losing our individual identities, and planned for a future that included both of our dreams, rather than requiring one person to sacrifice for the other. Our wedding was small and simple, held in the garden of my first apartment building with Rebecca as my matron of honor and members of the Phoenix Society serving as bridesmaids. I wore a dress I had chosen myself, carried flowers from my own garden, and felt more beautiful and confident than I had ever felt in my life. During our vows, I promised James not just love and faithfulness, but honesty and growth, and the commitment to remain the person he had fallen in love with, while continuing to evolve into whoever I was meant to become. He made the same promises to me, and I knew he meant them because our entire relationship had been built on those principles. The reception was held in the converted department store, in the space I had created through my own vision and effort and determination. As we danced our first dance as husband and wife, I looked around at the people who had come to celebrate with us: business partners and employees, members of the Phoenix Society, Rebecca and David and their new baby, James's grown children and their families, and dozens of friends I had made through my work and volunteer activities. It was a gathering of the life I had built for myself, the community I had created around the woman I had chosen to become. It was also a celebration of second chances and new beginnings, of the possibility that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing that happens to you. As the evening wound down, Rebecca found me during a quiet moment and pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped box. A wedding gift, but also something else. Inside the box was a key, old and tarnished but carefully polished, attached to a small card that read, "The key to apartment 2B, where two women learned that healing is possible, forgiveness is powerful, and friendship can bloom in the most unlikely soil. Thank you for teaching me that strength and grace are not opposites." I stared at the key for a long moment, remembering all the times I had stood outside that apartment door, all the conversations we had had in that space, all the ways it had served as the unlikely foundation for both of our transformations. "I don't live there anymore," Rebecca said. "David and I bought a house last month. But I wanted you to have this as a reminder of how far we've both come, of how much we've both grown." "Thank you," I said, closing my fingers around the key. "For everything. For your friendship. For your partnership. For showing me that it's possible to build something positive from the most painful circumstances." "Thank you for saving my life," she replied. "Not just by buying the building, but by showing me that I was worth saving." Later that night, as James and I sat on the balcony of his house that was now our house, I told him about the key and what it represented. I told him about the woman I had been when I first knocked on apartment 2B's door, driven by anger and humiliation and a desperate need for answers. I told him about the woman I had become through the process of choosing grace over revenge, understanding over condemnation, building over destroying. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Buying the building, working with Rebecca, choosing forgiveness over anger?" "Never," I said without hesitation. "That choice changed everything for me. It taught me that I had more strength than I knew, more capacity for growth than I had ever imagined. It taught me that I could choose who I wanted to be instead of just accepting who I thought I was." "And who did you choose to be?" I thought about that question, about the journey from Marcus's funeral to this moment, about all the decisions and risks and acts of courage that had brought me here. "I chose to be someone who builds rather than destroys," I said. "Someone who creates opportunities rather than just accepting circumstances. Someone who helps other people discover their own strength rather than keeping all the power for myself. Someone who chooses love based on reality rather than fantasy, partnership based on equality rather than dependency. I chose to be free," I continued. "Free from other people's definitions of who I should be. Free from the belief that my worth depends on someone else's approval. Free from the fear that taking risks means I might fail. I chose to be brave enough to succeed on my own terms." James reached for my hand, and I felt the weight of my new wedding ring, so different from the one I had worn for 27 years. This ring was a symbol of choice rather than obligation, of partnership rather than possession, of a future I was actively creating rather than a past I was trying to preserve. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "for everything you've accomplished, everything you've overcome, everything you've become." "I'm proud of me too," I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it completely. As we sat together in comfortable silence, I thought about Marcus and the life we had shared, and the woman I had been during those years. I didn't hate him anymore, didn't feel angry or betrayed or diminished by his choices. He had been a flawed person making flawed decisions, and those decisions had caused real pain and real consequences. But they had also set in motion a series of events that had led to this moment, to this life, to this version of myself, that I never could have imagined when I was 28 years old and walking down the aisle at St. Catherine's Church. Marcus's betrayal had destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but it had also forced me to build the life I actually needed. His death had ended our marriage, but it had also begun my real life, the life where I made my own choices and pursued my own dreams and defined success on my own terms. In the end, the greatest revenge I could have asked for was this: becoming so much more than he had ever imagined I could be, building something so much greater than what we had built together, finding happiness so much deeper than what I had settled for during our marriage. Rebecca was right. Strength and grace are not opposites. Neither are forgiveness and justice, healing and accountability, moving forward and honoring the past. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's choices define the rest of your story. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in becoming someone they never had the vision to see. I was 66 years old, and I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.